please join me welcoming Dr. Ed Krupp.
Scholars have correlated the so-called Maya long count dates with equivalent dates in our calendar. Obviously, the Maya, when they're writing down, they don't tell us, oh, by the way, this corresponds to July 4th, 1776. They're just not there with our calendar. They are, of course, inscribing in their calendar. But specialists, in fact, have managed to work out correlations. It's a very complex detective problem. But just as we give a number to the year that is counted from an historically and culturally significant event, the presumed year of the birth of Christ, Maya years were numbered from a date that was also endowed with religious and cosmogonical significance, and that was the date, as far as they were concerned, of the creation of the present era. And a long count date, then, a date like this, is really nothing more than a sum or a tally in days from that mythic startup date. And most experts believe that that mythic startup date corresponds to a date in our calendar that we would identify as August 11th, 3114 BC. Tonight, we are not going to explain why they picked August 11, 3114 BC. And the reason we're not going to do that is because we really don't know. That doesn't mean people don't, try to know. But there hasn't been a fully satisfactory explanation of this yet. The correlation equates dates in our calendar then with dates in the so-called Maya long count, and there are actually several correlations. That's what's really terrific about stuff like this, is that you get people disagreeing with each other, and so it makes everything even more ambiguous. But fortunately, the correlations are all pretty close, and there's really no point in arguing over a day here or a day there, and so people, for the most part, don't, unless you're caught up in some conference somewhere. So all of the best assessments are about the same. A long count date, then, is stated in terms of the Maya calendar intervals, and almost all of the Maya calendar intervals accumulated in multiples of 20. We don't do that. We accumulate, at least as far as specifying a year, in all of our numbers in a decimal system, in units or multiples of 10. But in Maya chronology and in Maya arithmetic systems, number 20 was the base number. And it's just as easy to do things in 20s as it is in 10s. We're just used to 10s. And so you have an interval of 7,200 days. That's like 20 years. It is called a katun, and it is 20 times the Maya estimate of the length of the year for calendrical purposes, 360 days. And so you multiply 20 by 360, you get 7,200 days. That's a katun. So that's one of the units that they add up. And it takes 20 katuns to complete a baktun, which is what we've been talking about, baktun 13. That's just 20 times 7,200, or, as I said earlier, 144,000 days, which is the next larger interval of Maya time. Now, you're probably all already weary, as smart as I know you are, of doing this arithmetic in your head to base 20. So we're not going to persist. We're not going to persist in this, but it's at least becomes evident how these numbers originate and why they were important in the discussion. So some ancient inscriptions do turn this date of the completion of Baktun 13 into an important reset milestone. That's what they turned it into, a reset milestone. That is, okay, time to start another cycle. Not everything's going to end. And there are other inscriptions that treat it quite the opposite, that do not treat it as a reset ending point at all. And so you get these local discrepancies between inscriptions as well. Why is that important? Because it means that there isn't a uniform belief, sort of a pan-Maya sensibility about the end of the world or the end of anything in Baktun 13. Now, the Maya, nonetheless, are regarded, and certainly perhaps justifiably, as having developed the most complicated mathematical astronomy in the New World prior to European arrival, and their astronomical calculations were referenced to a set of calendar cycles that have been adapted throughout Mesoamerica. We're not going to go into detail in the intricacies of the calendar, but I am going to show you lots of pictures that make it look like we're going into the intricacies of the calendar. And so this sort of gear work of wheels turning in wheels is actually showing how two different cycles of time manage to mesh with each other to produce a succession of day names, dates in the Maya timekeeping system. And the purpose of the slide is really to demonstrate the fact that it is a sophisticated and complex system of calendrics, and one that worked very well for them. So they clearly do deserve respect for having developed and utilized that. Although there is some dispute over just who it was that actually originated these calendrical conventions, the pre-classic Gulf Coast Olmec civilization is usually given credit most of the time for that. This is one of the early steles carved monuments from Olmec territory on Mexico's Gulf Coast, Stela C, and it carries a long count inscriptions. Those bars and dots are numbers, and that numbering system persisted throughout Mesoamerica, and it appears to originate around this time, if not with the Olmec culture. That's just a photograph of a piece of the actual monument there. So our understanding of Maya astronomy is inextricably bound to an understanding of the writing system of the Maya, and we know about Maya astronomy because the Maya did write it down. It's still a wonder, however, that we know anything at all. Almost all of the direct evidence of their involvement of the sky was lost in the conquest. The few hieroglyphic picture books, texts, or codices known to have survived in the chronicles, those accounts by native informants at the time of the conquest and just after it, reveal an incomplete but nonetheless substantive body of information from which much of the calendar has since been reconstructed by scholars. In addition, recognition and interpretation of monuments like these, this is another Maya carved stela or inscription, you get astronomical and calendrical components in these inscriptions that also have added more data to the overall analysis of these things, which has, of course, taken more than a century to put together, but we have a pretty good understanding of it now. And the basic calendar was known to have been based on the length of the year. Makes sense. It was a 365-day year, actually, an annual solar count, the so-called vague year. You see the word Hab up there in the corner. That's just the Mayan name for this particular cycle. And those 365 days were broken down into 20-day intervals. So once they established, of interest to themselves, the length of the solar year, they then subdivided it just as we do, but they didn't subdivide it the same way. They broke it into intervals of 20 days, and those glyphs refer to those intervals. So just get a picture of how that was put together. This is really why, though we don't have a lot of the information we'd like to have, our knowledge of this basic material originates, on the one hand, with Bishop Diego de Landa in 1566, really the first anthropologist of the Yucatan, and without his account of those things in Yucatan, we would be much the poorer. But at the same time, he presided, of course, over the burning and the destruction of many of the traditions, as well as the many written texts that were in existence at that time. The old solar calendar, interestingly enough, survived until quite recently. Anthropologist Gary Gosson reported a Chamula calendar board. You see it photographed here. It's about the size of a door. In fact, it is an old door, from Chiapas, Mexico. And it has, in fact, 365 marks on it. And if you look carefully, you'll see that they are grouped in 20s, with a group of 5 at the very end, which is for the 5 epigomenal days to round out 365. So these kinds of traditions persisted, of course, very late. And the old solar calendar also seems to have been symbolized in some Mesoamerican ruins. And some of you, of course, may have visited these or know them. This is, of course, the Pyramid of the Niches at El Tajín. It is said that the niches that make this the Pyramid of the Niches total 365. And, of course, when I first went to El Tajín, it was important to count the niches. And I did. And then at Chichen Itza, you may know the Castillo, very famous pyramid there, of course. And this monument, in fact, Landa himself says that if you count the steps, and as you saw on the previous slide, there are 4 stairways. If you count the steps in each stairway, add them all up, they all add up to 365. And so it was important when I first went to Chichen Itza decades ago to count the steps, and I did. So, we know the calendar. You probably wonder what the answer is, don't you? Well, we'll see about that later, okay? We know that the calendar was accurate. The accuracy was equivalent to saying the length of the tropical year, that is the solar year, the seasonal year, is 365.2550 days. That's a good result. That is not how they expressed it. They did not express in decimal fractions with precision like that. But the true answer, if you were doing a comparison, is 365.2422 days. So the Maya estimate's only 19 minutes off in a year. And that's a very respectable astronomical result. Their calculations were actually even better than this, but don't be misled. It does not mean that the Maya had instruments so precise that they could measure the length of the year with a single observation to this accuracy. And I point these kinds of details out because as these discussions proceed, a romance surrounds people like the Maya. They were good at what they did, but we wind up attributing to them more than what they did, not because they were interested, but because we're interested, and it mystifies us. Most of us couldn't estimate the length of the tropical year to 365.2422 days, so somebody else does. That's impressive. But no, you assign people to do it, they work it out. How does the operator know what time it is? Calls Google, that's how. Well, it's important, again, because apparently uncanny calendric accuracy was achieved by the Maya, people who in general, people are ready to think that they might have known something about calendar and time and astronomy in the future that we don't. This is really not true, but you'll hear these uninformed claims to the contrary, and they fuel the conflagration of 2012.